Okay, thanks. So thank you very much for joining us for this webinar. It's an interesting subject, innovation, and the title's a good one. Innovation must go on even in tough times, and these really are tough times for everyone. But this is the point at which innovation can actually be most helpful for us. About me, I'll give myself a very brief introduction. I was the VP of Innovation and Design at Qlik Technologies. Before that, I was at Microsoft running business intelligence teams there. And I've been working in the data analytics and product design space, software product design space for many years, actually about 30 years since I built my first software product commercially, which was if anybody's interested, it was a fishing product. It was a product for the fishing industry, and our first customer was in Japan, and that was a long time ago. But I've got a lot of experience, frankly, in dealing with both software design, but also innovation design in general, not just in the software world. I've worked on all sorts of products, got a pretty diverse career. What I wanted to kind of talk about today was innovation and how innovation can help us, and how we should think about innovation at this time. It's useful to understand what is innovation first. And I like to say that innovation is not just new ideas. Lots of us have new ideas. I think I have a new idea every time I have a bath or a shower. I come out of the bath, oh, I just had this great idea. But if you don't do anything with it, doesn't become innovative. It's just an idea. Innovation actually, it needs three things to happen. The first is that innovation is not just something new, but it's something that's fundamentally different from what has gone before. Just having a new feature, just having a new product, a new service isn't enough unless it's different from what went before. And one of the ways it could be different is by addressing one of the basic questions. And the basic questions I have here are who, what, why, when, where, and how. They're sometimes called the 6 friends because they're such important basic questions. I think sometimes in the commercial world, there's a 7th question, which is how much. But basically, innovation gives a new answer to one of these fundamental questions, and not just a slightly new answer. It gives a radically new answer. To give you an example of that, going back a few years ago in the software market, about 2008, when we had the last kind of big financial crisis, the global financial crisis, a lot of companies who were working on business intelligence and analytics and data warehousing and all those areas of data analysis realized that they actually needed not just the IT department to be able to do these things, but everybody needed to be able to do them. Suddenly in that crisis, which was a financial crisis, so there was a lot of analysis to be done, you couldn't wait for IT. Everybody had to be able to do it. So you took this who question, who builds reports, who builds dashboards, who builds analytics, IT? No, in the new world, in the innovative world, everybody can do it on their desktop. And that's how products like Qlik and Power BI and Tableau became so important. So that innovation answered a basic question in a radically new way. But as I suggested, it's not enough just to have the idea of doing that. You also have to do the work. And this is sometimes disappointing to people, but innovation involves a lot of work. It involves the work of experimenting with the product, of testing the product, of testing the audience, testing the market for it, testing the pricing and the viability. It's not just enough to say, well, I've had this great idea, so I'm innovative. Innovation involves bringing the idea to life. I think it was Thomas Edison who said that, being an inventor was 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. A lot of work involved in actually bringing these features to life. The other thing about innovation we always have to remember is it's short-lived. And what I mean by that is something is only innovative for a short time. And then when everybody else starts doing it, it's no longer innovative. Even if you were the first one to do it, your innovation, I sometimes like to say that innovation is fresh in the way that fruit is fresh. It's only fresh for a short time. It's only fresh and delicious for a short time. After a while, it becomes stale and uninteresting, and it's no longer innovation. So this is there's a bit of pressure here. You have to have something which is radically different, which involves a lot of work, or involves work to bring it to the world, and it's short-lived. So innovation is exciting, but it's also kind of high pressure and it's hard work. The other thing about innovation is I like to think that it can turn our old thinking around. There's a very famous designer, some of you may have heard of him, called Don Norman. And Don Norman wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things, and which is a very influential design book. And he also wrote several books, The Psychology of Everyday Things and Emotional Design. Very well-known designer who'd worked at Apple and with lots of other significant companies. And I had a great opportunity about 4 years ago now to go visit Don Norman in his office. And when I went into his office, he had a whiteboard, and on the whiteboard was written one thing, and it's this picture. It says, "The car is an accessory to the smartphone." And I, what does this mean? That seems a kind of strange thing to say. And he said, "Well, how did you get to my office?" Well, I flew down from Seattle on the plane, and I got off the plane, and I called an Uber or a Grab, and we came out to your office. He said, "Well, so you came by phone?" I said, "Well, we came by car." He said, "Yeah, but you used the phone to get it. If you could have used some other technology, that's how you'd have got there. But the phone was the thing that actually got you here. The phone was your interface that got you here, not the car." So he says, and if you think of it that way, it doesn't matter which car turned up. It could be I once got picked up in a Maserati in Las Vegas or in an Uber, which was very exciting. But most of the time, it's just a small little cheap kind of Nissan Micra or something that might pick you up. So I don't care what the car is. The car is an accessory to my smartphone app that gets me somewhere. And that's a way of thinking which is very innovative. It actually turns what we normally think of completely upside down. And innovation can do that. Innovation can take our existing knowledge, take one of these 6 or 7 basic questions, and turn it around completely. So when we were working in the last crisis and thought, who does analytics, who builds reports, who builds dashboards? And the answer is only these few special people. You turn that around and say, well, what if everyone could do it? What would that product need to look like? What would that product need to behave like? And that's how you get innovation in that situation. I want to suggest that there's different kinds of innovation. And I think the 3 are the new products that you can build, so completely new things. You can improve an existing product, or you can actually add new features to a product. Now, I've taken this example of the vacuum cleaner, I think, because we're all familiar with it. It's not a high technology. Well, it's getting to be a high technology example now, but it's not originally. We have this old Edwardian lady with her huge vacuum cleaner, sort of an interesting device. And how have things improved by then? Well, at the time, that was a new product. It didn't exist. Nothing like it exists. So that was a radical new innovation at that time. Completely changed the world of cleaning. And then, of course, we've had many improvements over the years. All sorts of improvements in vacuum cleaners. We've had, of course, the bag that was added, the bagless vacuum cleaner, all sorts of fancy features now in vacuum cleaners. And then people have added new features. So our vacuum cleaner, for example, you can switch it in the other direction and it will blow and it becomes an air pump to pump up your airbed. And that's a new feature. That's literally turning your product around in the other direction, but it's a feature that's added to your vacuum, a new capability that's added to it. And nowadays you get these modern robot vacuum cleaners that can wander around the house completely on their own with no control, cleaning the floor on their own, kind of like intelligent robots. So different types of innovation. And sometimes you have to decide what it is you're trying to do. Are you trying to build something completely new, a new product? Are you trying to improve something that's existing? Or are you trying to add completely new features and capabilities to an existing product, which is a way of improving it, but you're not just making it better, you're making it different by doing that. So those are 3 types of innovation. You need to have an idea, I think, of which one you're trying to work towards. The other thing about innovation is that it has to be continuous. I said it's like fruit, it's fresh only for a very short time. So innovation is short-lived. But if you take the evolution example here of the evolution of the Apple mouse, it evolved over time. They didn't just build a mouse once. And each example has some innovation in it. Some of them are very bad examples. The blue round puck mouse, as they call it, was horrible and everybody hated it, even though it was built by one of the world's greatest designers, Johnny Ive, who went on to design many other great things, including the iPhone and the Apple Watch and so on. but he made a mess of that one, and it was very unpopular. And if you look back at the very first mouse on the right-hand side, it looks terrible now. But at the time, it was very, very innovative. It was actually also innovative because it only had one button, and that was radical at the time when most people had 2 or 3 buttons on their mouse. So you continuously innovate. If you just do it once and stop, then very soon you're not innovative at all. And then where do we invest? And I think this gets very interesting. How do you invest in innovation? Where would you actually put your money, if you like? If you invest in market trends, if what you're doing is researching what's already going on in the market, what I'd suggest is, first of all, you end up building a product which is more or less the same as everybody else, because everybody else is doing market research as well. All your competitors can also do market research. So what you end up with are products which tend to become very similar. That's not to say they don't have some differences, but that differentiation requires really excellent market knowledge. What really matters to our customers? Is it the better camera? Is it the easier email? Is it the better sound quality of our music? What are we going to be different on? And you need to execute very efficiently, because you need to be building these new products, whatever they are, as quickly as your competitors are doing. Otherwise, you'll very rapidly fall behind. So investing in market trends is possible. It's certainly worth doing, but it needs this excellent market knowledge, and you need to be very efficient to make it work. And as I look at the cell phone examples, most cell phones end up being pretty much the same, or differentiating on small features, or 1 or 2 features that make a difference. Another thing that you can look at is cultural trends. Now, cultural trends also require basic research. In this case, well, I like the example of the iPad. This is the first iPad, and we have a picture of a little boy using them. And it's true, babies can use iPads. My cat can use an iPad. She plays a little cat game with a fish on it on the iPad. She loves playing that in the morning. They're so easy to use. And one of the things that Apple realized was that the touch screen on the phone enabled a new kind of computing device. People were using phones in a unique way. And they realized that this wasn't just a feature of the phone, it was actually a cultural trend. It was easier to use touch devices than any other kind of device. When we moved to America in 2000, and for years we tried to connect to my parents-in-law, to my mother-in-law, who was in her 80s. We bought her a computer, we tried to set up a webcam, couldn't possibly work, never use it. We got her an iPad. I was able to teach her how to use it over 1 cup of coffee in an afternoon, and then we stayed in touch on the iPad ever since, because it was so easy to use. But one thing, and that came out of cultural understanding that something was changing in society that would make this device possible and useful and powerful. But it needs really good design thinking in order to take these ideas and put it together. So I think cultural trends and innovation are really, if I can put it this way, you need really good design capabilities in order to do that. Another way to look at innovation is to invest in behavioral analysis. And this is where products like Mixpanel become really interesting, because now you can actually start to watch what people are doing. Now, the example I've given here isn't actually a technology example in the sense that I'm not tracking these people in these restaurants with technology. I'm actually just watching what they're doing. And it turns out that by watching them, I see that what the managers do every day, they have Excel spreadsheets, and they spend a lot of time at the end of every day putting all their data into Excel. And I worked with a company in the Philippines called Restograph, which is now part of another group. And we built a product that just automatically analyzed restaurant data, so nobody had to put it into Excel. You could just take the point of sale system and then automatically tell the manager interesting things, like, do you know that you sell more tacos on a Friday than any other day? Maybe that's a good day to do a special offer or something like that, and give that kind of insight. But we got that by observing what people were doing. Now, when you look at a software product, or you look at a service, or you look at a web page, being able to watch users' behavior on the web page gives you unique insight and can start to lead you to answer some of these basic questions in different ways. How are people using the website? How could they use it differently? Who's using it? What if a different class of user was using it? What if I changed that? What if I changed fundamentally some of these questions? What if I made it mobile so that I answered the where question in a different way? Where do people do this? When do people do that? Right now, we're actually analyzing a lot of changed behavior because where people do their work has changed dramatically. People aren't in offices. People are now all working from home. And so the technology that worked while you were all in the office may not work when people are working from home because it may rely on a whole set of interactions, conversations, and things that are not happening now. You can capture that, you can understand some of that by analyzing user behavior. And you can start to look for things that are working, things that are not working, and new ways to answer those basic questions. The other thing about investing in innovation when you come to behavioral analysis is that it's not limited to features. If you want to have a compelling innovation, you also have to have not just great features, you have to have a great story behind the innovation. I'm giving this example of the iPhone. You know, back in before the iPhone came out, I think we probably all had MP3 players for our music, and we had phones. Maybe a Nokia phone was a very common one at that time, or a Motorola back in those days. So I had my Nokia. I could travel all over the world and make phone calls. It was great. And I had my music player, like everybody else. I had a little iPod, and that played music. And so it was great. The world was actually good. I had all my music with me. Nowadays, it doesn't seem like very much, but I think I had like 8 gigabytes of storage, which seemed huge. And then I had my phone, which could make phone calls all over the world. And I had 2 devices. It's a bit of a hassle. I had to take 2 chargers and things like that. And Apple kind of made a joke of this and said, what if we just made an iPod that could make phone calls? And they even made a joke of it on stage and pretended that was going to be the product they would launch. We'll make an iPod that makes phone calls. But actually what they really released was something different. They didn't just release a phone that plays music. They called it your life in your pocket, the ultimate digital device. And that's a different narrative. That's a radically different narrative. It's not just about improving the phone. It's about making something dramatically and radically different. And of course, they were right. This is your life in your pocket now. That's what your smartphone is. And it's very interesting that how they did this. And what I want to do is actually tell you a little bit about that narrative. So narratives are stories. And it's very important to be able to tell the story of your innovation. If you think of a sort of basic narrative, I've taken the example of a kind of fairy tale or a folk legend kind of story. You know, there's a scene setting. And very importantly, I want to tell you that in the scene setting, everything's pretty good. You think of any of your kind of favorite movies or, you know, whatever, favorite stories from childhood, they nearly always start off in a good place. They don't plunge you straight into the middle of the problem. They start in a good place, and then there's a problem. And then in response to that problem, you have to go on a journey or a quest, which reaches a crisis, and then the crisis gets resolved. Sometimes there's a big fight or something, I don't know, like that. And then there's a resolution, and then you end up in a new scene, a new normal, if you like, as we say nowadays. And this is kind of important because there's an emotional level there where things get bad, the quest is difficult, there's a crisis, but then at the end, we're all happily ever after, as they say. The important part of this story is that the quest has to be interesting and challenging, but also I always want to emphasize the importance of the first scene, getting it right, making people in a good situation at the beginning. So the reason for this is that, especially in a crisis, it's easy to focus on the problem. The number of times I speak with innovation teams or product design teams or service design teams, and the first thing they say is, well, we need to understand the problem. And my answer to them is always, no, you don't. You need to understand what's good before you understand the problem. Understand what's good in your customer, in your partner, in your audience's situation. So when you start the story, you start in a good place. Now, that's very important because if you don't have that positive start, if you don't understand what's positive, you can undermine the user by just focusing on the problem. I'll give you an example of this from my own work. We've had a case of somebody building software for business users and saying, you know, the problem for business users is they have far too much data. They're drowning in data. You've probably heard this phrase. People say, they use terms like, oh, they're drowning in data. There's a tsunami of data. There's an avalanche of data, just too much data. We have to solve that problem. And then they build tools which aggregate the data or filter the data or give them summaries of the data or give them some sort of insight. But they've forgotten something, which is actually having a lot of data is a good thing. It means you've got more information than ever before. If they had started saying, you know what's really good? We have a fantastic amount of data. We've got more data about our customers. We've got more data about our products. We've got more data about the market than ever before. The problem is, it's difficult to make sense of it because there's so much of it. Now the journey would be a different journey. It would be making sense of data out of a large data set, but that large data set is an asset. It's a great thing. If you think of it as a problem, then you may actually lose sight of that. Or for one thing, you may lose sight of the detail because you get rid of all the detail to create a summary. Or you may throw away data that you don't think is useful, only to find later that it was useful all along. I know some of you are in financial services. I once worked in exactly this example where we took all the transactions that failed and threw them out of the system so that people could do analysis of all the good transactions in order to see trends in sales and usage of credit cards and things like that. But then the fraud analysis people came along and said, we want to look at all the failed transactions. But we'd thrown them all away. We'd removed them all from the system because we thought they were a problem. But it turns out for some people, they're a positive. It's a great thing to have all this data. So it's really important. And I want to emphasize this, I say especially in a crisis, because right now, it's really easy to focus on the problem. Everything's a problem. So you look at what's our problem, rather than saying, okay, where are we? What is good in our situation? And then what's the problem that gets in the way of that? And then the journey that you take people on, that's how you describe your answer to the problem. Is it a journey of taking them on a journey of self-service analysis? Is it a journey of insight? Is it a journey of discovery? Is it a journey to lower costs? That sort of thing. And then there will be a crisis, and the crisis will be, I don't know if I want that product. I don't know. Maybe there's another product that would be different and maybe it's competitive with it. Maybe the product's too expensive. Maybe it's too cheap and I don't trust it. So now you have to get over that crisis. Apple did this, brilliantly. I have to say, and I'll tell you a little bit about how they did that. But the journey has to be meaningful and significant. And it's your statement about your work. This is the journey I am taking you on. What Apple did with the iPhone was said, this isn't just a phone that makes, this isn't just an MP3 player that makes phone calls. He said, this is your life in your pocket. We're taking you on a journey to the ultimate internet communicator, something out of sci-fi. That's a journey to take people on that's worth doing. If you get it wrong, then there's no emotional content to your story. It's just, I've got a cell phone and MP3 player. I've got too many devices. Okay, here's a phone that plays music, or here's a music player that makes phone calls. And the answer to that is, okay, well, there's no crisis. I'll just get one when I upgrade. But there's no excitement. There's no emotional commitment. And that's interesting because they're just building Me Too solutions that anyone else could build. What you really want is something that actually requires emotional commitment from your customer. It requires your client to be bought in. It requires your audience to commit to you in some way. And if you can tell that a narrative that enables people to do that, then you've got an innovation that's going to resonate with people. So what is innovation again? Back to that. To me, innovation is answers to these basic questions. And when I run innovation workshops or do innovation strategy with people, very often we just sit down and we go through these questions and we take parts of their product or their whole product or their whole service and we take it apart and we think about these questions and see if we can come up with new answers. And there's ways of doing that to come up with that. We make sure that the innovation is meaningful and impactful because we try to tell that narrative. And if the narrative isn't convincing, we know we're not innovative enough at that point. And we have to build in a strategy so that innovation is continuous. We don't just do it once. In other words, you have to build an innovation practice, an innovation process in order to make that in order to make that effective. So that's kind of run through of how I think about innovation and my kind of key issues in innovation. Right, yeah. Well, so one of the things that happens in crisis, of course, everybody looks at finance as being the biggest problem, and that is, there's no doubt that's a huge problem. So one of the kind of innovations that people often look at is how can we do things more cheaply? Or I've often said that we have the 6 questions, and the 7th question should be how much. And so one of the most interesting innovations that I didn't work on myself, many people worked on it, was when people started to create open source software, where the answer to how much should the software cost was kind of, well, nothing. That's not what you pay for. You pay for the services round about it. That was very, very interesting. That actually came out of the dot-com crash. And it came out of that period when it had been around for a while before that, but it really became mainstream at that time because there were lots of software companies which had great technology and great ideas, but people wouldn't buy it. People wouldn't pay for it. But they knew if they could get people using the software, they might pay for training, they might pay for services, they might pay for support. So that was a really interesting response to a crisis of, let's make the upfront costs nothing. And then the other costs will come through, through those services. That was very, very radical and very innovative. Around the same time, one of the technologies that I worked on was, it was a measuring technology for machines that are manufacturing machines, so like lathes and drills and things like that. And they wear down very quickly. The motors are going like crazy, and you can put, nowadays you would put Internet of Things, you put little sensors on them, and you could capture all that data. But back in say 2000, you really couldn't do that. We didn't have that technology. I think one of the things that helped them to generate ideas was that they didn't, how could I put this? They were very systematic about it. They didn't just wait for sort of inspiration. This is kind of important. They didn't wait for inspiration to strike. They didn't do brainstorming and hope that an idea would come up. They very methodically went through the processes of, what is the problem we are trying to solve? Starting with the good situation, which is people have equipment and they have a lot of equipment, but there's a problem, which is that it's breaking down. To take the equipment example, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How can we solve it for every kind of equipment? And that led to the question of, well, what does all equipment have in common? Which led to the answer of, well, they have an electric cable and they use electricity. So why not address the problem there? And now can we make it practical? So that was actually very methodical. I think the open source software was also very, very methodical, and it came from the realization that we can't sell this stuff. People are not buying it. But they still need this solution, or we think the solution is still valuable for them. What else could we sell? And so that was kind of interesting as well, So actually one of the things I like to tell people is that innovation is not just inspiration and genius. It's actually a very practical thing. You can teach people how to do it by sitting down in workshops and walking through practical examples in a logical and methodical way. And that's pretty important. It's also very encouraging because you don't have to wait for inspiration to strike. You can just do the hard work of doing it right now. The way you describe it is absolutely the way people do it, but it's missing out what I think is one very important point, which is that if you intend to scale that product, you can't wait until you've gone through the design process and then see if it scales. You actually have to design and test scalability from day one. So when I was working at Microsoft, for example, when we started to move products to the cloud, we knew we couldn't just take an existing product, put it on the cloud and see if it works. We had to actually design some things from day one and then test it from day one. I got a real shock when I went to Microsoft. I was being interviewed by somebody, and obviously the interview went well, but there was an interesting conversation. They asked me to design something. They asked me to design a feature. I can't remember what, I think it was about connecting to wireless or something. So I designed this feature in the interview, and then they said, well, so that's interesting. How would this be different if it had to be used by 500 million people? And I said, wow, that's quite a question. He said, yeah, but that's our audience. You know, Microsoft sells software to 500 million people. How would this be different? Or would it be different? And what they were getting across to me was, you can't design something and then modify it to suit your use case. You have to design it with that use case from the very beginning. So my answer to you was rather than moving from an early version to a working version to scaling it, I would make sure I was testing scale with my early versions right at the very beginning. The earliest version, the first build I made. Now, of course, I can't give it to millions of users, but I can simulate that. Or at the very least, I can simulate some of the conditions that I might meet in that. So I would suggest that maybe turn it around and think, how can I start with something that scales and then add features to it to build a complete product? Sure. So I tell you, one of the big differences, of course, is because we're all now working from home, we are not engaging with each other casually in the office. This is something I sort of mentioned earlier. So very often I've been in design groups where people have said, we'll answer this problem or we'll address this problem by sitting in an office and thinking about it. And we'll whiteboard together and we'll brainstorm and we'll do these things. And you can't do that on a Zoom meeting. It just doesn't work. Because you don't have the engagement with people and you can't just kind of jump up and do something. Now, honestly, I don't think it worked very well anyway, but that kind of engagement is gone completely. So we have to replace it with other ways of working. And a really good example of that would be a system, I call it a charrette system. And I think architects, you might be familiar with the idea of a charrette, where it's kind of a way of gathering public input from people. Architects always have the problem that their buildings affect everybody who works in the building, everybody who lives in the building, everybody who walks past the building has an opinion about the building. And you can't possibly get all that feedback. But what you can do is run feedback sessions where you take selected stakeholders from the group and get feedback from them, and then start to build that together into a coherent picture. In product design, rather than getting everyone in a room, as we would traditionally do, it is possible to go around and have one-to-one conversations with people. In fact, that works much better when you're working remotely than having multiple people together. And then two things come out of that that are really interesting. The first is that there are people who are very innovative, but they don't speak up in meetings because they're shy, or because there's somebody else who is louder or more forceful, or somebody who sounds more knowledgeable but isn't. And when you go around one by one, those people suddenly are all evened out, and the quietest voice can be heard. And you may get more innovation as a result of that. That gets pretty interesting. And the other thing that comes out is people get a sense of engagement with it that they don't get when you put them in the group meeting. They feel that they're contributing more because they're contributing personally rather than being subsumed into the group. So one of the most interesting things that happens when we're in the situation of working remotely is you can use it to your advantage by saying, what are the things that we can only do remotely? Or what are the things that we cannot do anymore? And therefore turn that around and say, what's the advantage of that? And one of the advantages is this ability to have, it's still group collaboration, but it's a group collaboration of individuals. And that's very powerful. It's difficult for me to make predictions, but I can use my technique of looking at the basic questions and seeing where that would take us, and what might change. So if you look at one of my basic questions, like who is the hospitality industry engaging with at the moment? And if you think of hospitality and tourism, it's almost everyone. Everyone loves to travel now, and we're all doing things. We're all traveling. Well, we're not all traveling all over the world, but people are traveling and using hotels and airlines more than ever before. Who will do that in the future? Mostly it'll be people who really have to, or are doing it for a special occasion, or are doing it for an important purpose. So all the casual, yeah, we could just do this, that will perhaps go away. I'm not necessarily making that as a prediction, but I think this is one of the ways to think about it. So who do we engage with would be an interesting parameter. But another interesting parameter is, why are we engaging with them? Why are they coming to us at all? Well, they're coming to us not because it's casual, but because it's now important to them to do it. So how do we interact with people for whom it is very important that their journey, their trip, their coming to our hotel is an important thing for them, not just a casual thing? And how do we make it feel important? And how do we respond to somebody for whom this is important, rather than just a casual thing? That might be interesting. Similarly, things like what did he do there? I give an interesting example. There's a hotel that I visit sometimes in when I travel with my wife. It's in America, and it's quite a nice hotel. And they have a floor of the hotel which is called the allergy-free floor. And they've made a really good job in making sure that there's no perfumes. All the toiletries and things are allergen-free. The carpets are all cleaned, and all the cleaning is done with allergy-free cleaners and things like that. And so anybody who's got allergy problems can stay at this hotel. They ask for the allergy-free floor, and there's actually an allergy-free lift they can go in as well. You're not supposed to use it if you've got perfume on and things like that. And so people can go and stay there. We have a really nice stay. That's very innovative. That's actually answering the question, not why are people coming to us, but why are they not coming to us? And then by looking at that inverted question, saying, well, how can we get the people who are not coming to us to come to us? And I think that's very, very interesting innovation. So I think we'll see, and I'm not really giving you a prediction, because I guess in a sense I don't know the hospitality business well enough, but my innovation technique, I think in a sense works, because it gives you a set of parameters to look at that you, with your knowledge, will be able to find radical answers to. Yeah, what's important here is something that I mentioned about investing in innovation, which is you have to understand where to make that investment. You have to have your research. It's very dangerous to try to innovate. People often say, oh yeah, I go by my gut feel, or I go by my instinct, which is okay for having the idea. But when it comes to actually making the innovation, you really need to measure. You need to measure what people are doing. You need to analyze real user behavior, not just guess what it is. And then as you build your innovation, you also have to analyze, how people are using it, whether it's in beta or release. When Nico was talking about scaling something, for example, yeah, sure, your real product will go out to maybe hundreds of thousands of users, where your test product went out to a few hundred. It's not just a matter of scale, although it's a very important matter of scale, but now you have a new audience who may behave very differently than your test subjects, because your test subjects are generally fairly carefully chosen. We used to say, when I worked at Microsoft, where we had millions of users, hundreds of millions of users, when we worked on Excel, we used to say that on day one of releasing a product, somebody will do something we never thought of, and will complain. It'll be a bug. And no matter how much you test it, that was always true. On day one, somebody would do something we never thought of. You've got to be capturing that. You've got to be using that in your analysis. Analysis is a very important part of asking these basic questions and coming up with new answers. Because if you don't know what the existing answer is, it's difficult to come up with a new one. And if you just guess at what the existing answer is, you can get it dramatically wrong. That is particularly important in a crisis like just now, because the behavior is changing. The behavior from 3 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, is different from what it is now. If you build your product based on the behavior of people 6 weeks ago, you're building the wrong product. It's already changed that much. And that's super interesting to me. You have to keep on top of what's going on in the market, in your product, in the culture. I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, my favorite example of this, I was in the store the other day and using my phone, and they were suggesting that people use touchless. And over here we don't really have contactless, but we do have FaceTime. The problem is, of course, you try to use FaceTime with a mask and it doesn't work. And so then you have to take your mask off, and then, what's the point? You either take your mask off or you end up using the usual credit card system. So you've kind of wasted at that point. But Apple are currently working on a way in which they will automatically allow for a mask in FaceTime. Not quite happening yet. Maybe by the time they get it right, but I think, that's the sort of thing that we need to be doing. We need to be watching what behavior actually is and how behavior changes. And this is especially true right now when behavior is changing dramatically and rapidly.
And that concludes today's virtual forum around innovating even in tough times. So thank you all for your participation today. And we hope that you found this a very fruitful and interesting discussion.